So we're going to get started this afternoon with a live stream report out on how the last 2 days went with the Shapiro Symposium. We're going to hear from Rob Glicksman a little bit later with a whole summary of what we discussed, some obstacles, some solutions that we've identified throughout the symposium. But first, we're going to hear from Dr. Ron Sutherland. He's a chief scientist of Wildlands Network. He received his PhD from Duke University, and he was instrumental in the vision and creation of the Eastern Wildway vision, which I'm sure he'll be talking to you more about this afternoon in the context of 30 by 30 policies and really 50 by 50 policies and why we need them. So thank you for joining us, Ron.
Let's see, and screen sharing is on. All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and then thanks for the invitation to give this talk. And hi, folks online, if you can see me. Let's dive in. My story this afternoon is going to start with a turtle, and it's not this kind of turtle. It's this kind of turtle, a snapping turtle, a lawyer's kind of turtle. It's thick-skinned, it's argumentative, it's capable of rapid and biting logic. And this particular snapping turtle was in my front yard, right next to our front porch under construction. And it was a female probably laying eggs, or we thought she was probably laying eggs. And so we left her alone. It's wasn't surprising to us because our backyard looks like this. There's a beaver swamp. We're definitely not underprivileged when it comes to access to nature. So we get a lot of turtles coming up to nest. And so it was not surprising, but things got kind of weird because we came back out in 30 minutes. And this snapping turtle was on our front porch trying to come in the door. And so we kind of stepped back and took pictures. And the turtle came in the door, and which is unusual behavior for a snapping turtle. And then it probably peed on the floor, which is something turtles do sometimes when they're trying to soften up the ground a little bit in order to lay their eggs. And so we were wondering whether this turtle was trying to rewild our house, rewild our floor there. I don't know what she was thinking, but it's a good reminder that snapping turtles in particular are tough. They're resilient creatures. They're pretty, they're good survivors. And it's also a good reminder that nature can survive if we just give her half a chance. Nature is tough. Nature is resilient. Nature, biodiversity, it wants to survive. And we can shorten that and just say nature can survive if we just give her half the planet. It's nothing too big to ask there. Let me step back just for a second to talk about Wildlands Network. We've heard from some of us at this great conference, but our mission is to reconnect, restore, rewild nature across North America so life and all its diversity can thrive. I'm the chief scientist. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina, and I've been with the organization since 2010. And I grew up chasing snakes in ponds, which is a character strength that I share with one of my conservation heroes, Edward O. Wilson. And I got the chance to talk to Ed Wilson about chasing snakes back then. And he was in town in Durham. But he was there to actually promote his book. He wasn't there to talk about snakes. Promoting his new book at the time, Half Earth. And that was his vision. He lays out this compelling vision for why we need to protect half the planet in order to save millions of species around the Earth. And I encourage you to check it out. We heard yesterday that Tony Hiss may have came up with the idea for the title, which is great. And Ed Wilson was not the first person to go and say that we needed to protect half the planet. Reed Noss, who was actually the first scientist for Wildlands Project back in the day, he in various publications called for saving half the Earth. Eugene and Howard Odom, if you look in Tony's book, actually you can get a good history of some of this. These were UGA professors down in Georgia, and they made the argument that to preserve ecosystem function, that we needed to save about half of the ecosystems out there. Before that, there was Victor Shelford, who back in the 1920s and 30s made an impassioned plea that we should save a representative system of nature reserves around the country. Imagine, as Tony and others have said, imagine if we had actually gotten that done back in the 20s and 30s. I think we could have hit 50 by 1950 instead of 2050 at that point. But needless to say, didn't happen. But here we are, and it's been about 100 years we've been talking about saving a large representative system of nature reserves, not just in the US, but across the world. We're not there yet, but let's, the question that I was asked to answer is sort of, why do we need to save 50%? Why do we need to save 30 by 30? And we'll get into that. So Ed Wilson and his colleague Robert MacArthur, they, like many good biologists before them, they turned to islands, and not just because islands are awesome, but islands are a great vehicle for understanding the way biology, ecology work. And they actually came up with this great new theory, the theory of island biogeography. And one of the tenets of that theory is that the number of species is closely related to the size of the island. There's a species area relationship. And if, for example, a small island might have just one species, a no-list lizard. There's lots of lizard biologists who go to islands too. And a slightly larger island might have 2 lizards, and then an even larger island might have 3 species of lizards, and so on. And we extrapolate that out to other taxa, other types of species, and so forth. What the biologists realize is there's often a fairly consistent relationship between the number of species and the size of the island. It scales to about the 4th root of the size of the island. So it's an exponential curve. And if you put that kind of relationship on a log-log scale, and here we're relating the area of the island, you can see it's a log scale, goes 10, 100, 1,000, so forth. And then the number of species, in this case, reptile and amphibian species on these Caribbean islands, you get a very linear relationship. It's a pretty strong relationship. And it's, Tony, I think, mentioned Bill Newmark yesterday, the biologist out in Utah, he's now in Utah anyways, who did some of the early work relating the loss of mammals from national parks. And Bill just sent me an email this week saying that, it's legit. This is one of the few sort of laws we actually have in ecology and biology that we have this species area relationship. And Ed Wilson and others came to the realization that we could actually extrapolate from that and say, not just think about islands, but also think about entire countries, entire continents, and in fact, the entire world. And that if you change the amount of habitat that is left for wild species, you're going to ultimately change the number of species that are going to be supported by what's left. And if you run that same kind of curve, the 4th root curve, and you have to zoom there, covering a little bit, but here's a curve, and you see this green arrow right here, that's 50%. So we lose half the habitat, but potentially we could save as much as 84, 85% of the species. And that's what Edward R. Wilson here in his quote is calling the safe zone, where most of the species on Earth could be saved. Of course, the alternative vision is 15% of habitat saved, we lose something like 40% of the species. And so that's that. If I don't want to give the impression that there's only one species area curve, and that it's such a great law that nothing, that we can actually predict to the nearest percent how many species are going to be lost if we lose this many million hectares of land around the world. It's not quite that good, but what is true is that there's lots and lots of studies show that there is a consistent relationship between the area of habitat and the number of species that it can contain. And if anything, to me anyways, it seems like this is a very conservative assertion that we're saying that we could actually lose half of the habitat on Earth and still maintain 85% of the species. I think arguably, that a lot of that's going to depend on what happens in the other half of the Earth, not just the half that we're setting aside for nature. But it's also an optimistic vision that if we can save half the Earth, at least half the Earth in a fairly good condition, we're going to save a lot of the species that we're worried about. Another line of argument comes from the field of landscape ecology, where if you map out a bunch of randomized landscapes, as this person Andren did back in 1994, you see that right around 50% is where the proportion of habitat remaining, and right around 50% habitat left in a given landscape, that's where things really start to congeal. You can see this. So going from left to right, as you get to 50%, that's where you start seeing small blocks of habitat congealing into one larger habitat network. Go the other way, that's where the habitat really starts to break up into small little blocks. And we, Wildlands Network, we care deeply about connectivity. For many reasons, I give a whole nother talk about why habitat connectivity, but species need to be able to move in response to climate change. We want to avoid inbreeding. We need to have genetic connectivity. Species need to have larger populations from being connected to maintain that demographic viability. And then there's a lot of species like pronghorn antelope out in Wyoming that have to move on an annual basis just to survive, go from their winter range to their summer range every year. So lots of good reasons for connectivity. And it turns out that you need a landscape that is at least 50% intact if you're going to maintain this basically a good habitat network. That's just another line of argument. Aaron mentioned the Eastern Wildway. Here's our vision map that I put together showing what a half Earth network for the eastern side of North America from Florida all the way up to Quebec, what that would look like, and hopefully in a sort of compelling and vivid way. It's not meant as a strict roadmap, but it's meant to inspire folks to see the beauty of what half Earth could actually look like for this particular part of the world. And we're working on mapping some of the other parts of the continent as well as our other folks. So what about 30 by 30? The conference has been focused on 30 by 30. The president has committed us to a 30 by 30 initiative. States like California and New York, as we heard yesterday, are aggressively pursuing 30 by 30. And other countries around the world are doing it too. And the short answer from a biological conservation perspective is 30 by 30 is not enough. If you look at the graph here, 30 by 30 gets you to roughly 75% of the species saved. And that means in the flip side of that is losing a full quarter of the Earth's biodiversity at 30% protected. But ultimately, I don't think that's the point. I think the point is you can't get to 50% protected without going through 30%. That's a fairly obvious thing. And so 30 by 30 is best viewed as an interim goal for getting us to where we need to be. And it's a smart interim goal. It's one of those smart goals that has a timestamp attached to it, which we struggle with sometimes in setting in our organization. It's the timing couldn't be more urgent right now to get us going in this direction. There's so much habitat destruction going on all over the world, not just in this country, but all over the world. And we really need this time-focused effort to get conservation moving fast if we're going to get to where we need to be. So that's the species extinction argument that, if we want to save biodiversity, we need to protect half the planet. And if we're going to protect half the planet, we have to get our rear ends in gear and get going with 30 by 30 if we're going to get there in time before we lose all the biodiversity that's out there. There's other good arguments as well that could be made, and I'll sort of breeze through a few of them. One of them has to do with the giant fusion reaction shown here. With global warming, we know that we need to make progress on saving wild nature if we're going to have a good chance of fighting off the climate change that's coming. Another conservation hero, Thomas Lovejoy, basically says if we can't solve the biodiversity crisis without solving the climate crisis, we can't solve the climate crisis without solving the biodiversity crisis. The two are interlinked, and I think that is sage advice. The only alternative is if we put a giant solar thing up in space and block the sun from getting to the Earth, because that could never go wrong. But there's two good reasons why saving wild nature is going to help in addressing climate change. One is, and you can barely see it, but avoid releasing carbon that's already stored in nature. And like this particular photo here is some nice flowers, but this is actually what's called a Pocosin wetland in eastern North Carolina. And this wetland is sitting on a massively deep amount of peat soils, deep carbon soils. And if this kind of habitat is lost, then we're just going to be releasing this massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. So we have to avoid that. We have to protect our natural carbon sinks that are out there. Another way of referring to those is natural carbon bombs, because if we lose them, like the boreal forest or the carbon that's stored in the ocean, we lose that stuff, then it's kind of like game over for addressing climate change. So we got to keep the carbon in the ground and in the water. And then the other good thing we need to do is to think about restoration so it can absorb even more carbon from the atmosphere. Because there's already, by most estimates, we already have pumped too much carbon dioxide and methane and things into the atmosphere. If we can restore habitats, then these new forests, new grasslands, new types of ecosystems, they can be absorbing that carbon back from the atmosphere and getting us where we need to be. And there's no shortage of places around the world, here in the US, around the world, to get that kind of restoration going. And from Wildlands Network standpoint, we can target that restoration so we're reconnecting the landscape at the same time. Tony mentioned this yesterday, that a paper just came out in the last couple of weeks from Schmitz et al. Saying that it's not just the vegetation that we need to restore, but we actually need to think about restoring the wildlife, because in many cases, the wildlife plays an important role in helping manage carbon stocks in the ground and in these ecosystems. And this is a red wolf I saw back in December in North Carolina. And in simple terms, the red wolves can help control herbivore populations, which helps keep the plant biomass going strong and getting that carbon stored in the ground where it belongs. So got to think about the animals too. Another line of reasoning comes from the rainfall patterns. We've heard that fresh water is important, and sorry you can't see these headlines with the things, but we now know that certain ecosystems like the Amazon rainforest, they make their own rainfall, and that's really cool. It's really interesting. The flip side of that is if we allow these giant ecosystems to be fragmented into tiny chunks or even relatively large chunks, we're not sure, but at some point, the relationship between the forest and the rainfall that it makes is going to break down, and the entire ecosystem is going to unravel and become something different, some sort of grassland, dry forest ecosystem. And that would be catastrophic from the standpoint of biodiversity. So we don't want to push that. I can't tell you right now what the threshold is, but we don't want to find out what the threshold was in past tense for the Amazon. I'm not a marine biologist, but I can play one. I'm a good snorkeler. When we talk about the oceans, there's a lot of emphasis that's been placed on marine protected areas and how effective they are at restoring fish populations. And so far that, for species like the Goliath grouper, which was actually protected strictly from fishing altogether. But a paper just came out and that addressed the question, how much of the ocean needs to be protected? It didn't just come out, it came out a few years ago. How much of the ocean needs to be protected in order to meet the goals of marine protected areas? And they reviewed all these different marine protected area studies and models and so forth. And they came up with the conclusion that on average, it was about 50% of the ocean needs to be protected if you want to meet the goals of why we're setting aside marine protected areas. And we could probably argue with that about that, but ultimately, if we're able to protect such a substantial portion of the ocean, manage a substantial portion of the ocean well from the standpoint of fishing, then it won't, we could actually envision a future where the oceans again teem with fish, like some sort of Miyazaki movie. This is from Ponyo there, and get us to where we want to be. So that's just a few big picture examples. Human survival depends on this, but I could go on and talk about pollination and medical treatments and so forth that come from biodiversity. I think you guys all know that kind of thing. Ultimately, if we want to survive, then we need to protect biodiversity. And if we want biodiversity to survive, we need to protect basically half the planet. But let's also talk briefly here at the end about human happiness, which is something I'm expertly trained to think about as a scientist. There's two competing visions of the world when it comes down to addressing whether we're going to chase this dream of protecting half the planet for biodiversity and to save ourselves. One of them is exemplified perhaps by this valley in Switzerland. This is actually the hidden valley in Switzerland that Tolkien visited and inspired him to come up with the secret elf realm of Rivendell. And it's just a beautiful landscape, but it has some things going for it that match this thing. It's got forest, it's got fresh water, has snow, so we know the climate hasn't been ruined yet. And then it's also got people living in this same environment. And I think, many of us would like to live in an environment like this. We can't all live in Switzerland, but the kind of world where this kind of environment would be happening is the kind of world that I would want to live in, The alternative is one where we allow the biosphere to be destroyed. This is a dystopian scene from the movie Blade Runner 2049. Apparently, we've made a lot of money, we've built a lot of buildings, but we've destroyed the Earth's capacity to support life. We've lost all the other species. Probably not worth it. The good news, this sort of thing, dystopian movies, I think, are generally speaking made by the directors as a warning to humanity to not do this. And so the good news is if we are able to move ourselves in the direction of protecting the planet, protecting the biosphere that we depend on, we can avoid things looking like this. Can't see these questions, but if you're thinking, yes, okay, half Earth sounds good, we should do this. But there's some big questions like, can we still do it? Can we still save half the planet? If so, which half? And then, the question that got asked yesterday, like what counts as being protected for half Earth? And each of those would take another 20, 30 minutes. Jamie did a good job addressing some of the whether it should count questions. And she actually had this same graph, same image here. I want to point you in this direction, this paper, Eric Dinerstein et al., 2019, Global Deal for Nature. And they asked for all the Earth's ecosystems. You can see these, the map on the top, it's got all the rainbow colors. Each of those is one ecoregion of the Earth. And they asked for those, how close are we to protecting 30% already, and then on to 50%. And so the map on the bottom, which you can almost see, is it shows the results from that. And the dark green areas, they're already 30% protected already. Light green is we could get to 30% just by protecting more habitat that's already there. Orange habitats mean that we need to restore some habitat, but it seems feasible. And then red is sort of like, oh boy, these ones are in trouble. Because often they're less than 20% protected, less than 20% intact, in fact, and much less protected. In some cases, they're down to 1 or 2%. So the short answer is, look at all that green, we can still get this done at the big picture. The bad news is we're going to lose some of these places, and we probably need to overcompensate in some of the green areas to make up for what we're going to lose in some of the other places. Anywho, to conclude, we have to save half for nature for the sake of millions of species, including ourselves. And let's get cracking on 30% by 2030, 30 by 30 to make it happen. It's a very important interim goal. We have to get going if we're going to get there. And is it going to be a challenge? Yes. Are there going to be people working actively against us at every stage? Yes. But have courage, as E.O. Wilson says, to strive against odds on behalf of all of life would be humanity at its most noble. And I'll give sort of future generations the next voice here, or the final word here. I don't want my kids or their friends to go to a conference in 40 years and hear about how E.O. Wilson was such ahead of his time. And imagine if we just listened to him 40 years ago, back in 2020 or 2023. We can get this done. It's going to take all the different tools at our disposal. We have to get conservation done. We have to have law and policy. We need philanthropy. We need outreach and education and advocacy. But most of all, we need the optimism and the energy and the courage to fight this fight and get it done for nature. So I will stop there. If folks have questions, yeah. Yeah, Yoshi.
Thank you, Ron. Very inspiring. So my question to you, for climate change, we have to stop greenhouse gas emission. Right? That's the only way. And meanwhile, the conserving half the planet may not be that fight. It could be a part of it. So do you think, like, a bit out of it, do we put the energy for protecting half the planet, or do we put energy really for the mitigation? It's a little out of it, but I just
Well, it's a good question. Like, I was involved in a project to save this forest in eastern North Carolina. It's called Hoffman Forest. It's about 80,000 acres. And somebody at NC State University did the calculations, and it had 40 gigatons of carbon in the top meter of soil. And we saved the forest. And so that's a lot of carbon that didn't get put into the atmosphere. And so I think ultimately the gains that you can make by keeping carbon in the forest, in these ecosystems, are not insignificant. And I think they're big, potentially a really big part of what we can do. But I wholly agree. We need to get ourselves off of burning fossil fuels. I don't think it's an either or. I think we can do both. And I think it ultimately, it's possible to conceive of a world where, especially with like fusion reactors, we could get to a world where we are carbon free and we've destroyed the planet just as well. And I don't want to live in that world either. I want to live in a world where, we're managing the climate, but we also have biodiversity.
I feel like I keep being the token Midwesterner in the room, but going back to your map, I noticed one of, on the map of North America, the entire Mississippi River was pretty much red. And my question would be, as we're thinking about which half do we save, is the idea, you know, these like, we then have the idea of sacrifice zones and like, maybe we'll just give up on the Mississippi River Basin, but like, also that's a lot of migratory bird routes. That's your monarch butterfly route that results in a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. That's pretty significant. So, I mean, I guess how, as we're thinking about what areas to save, like, do we bail on some things because they're too hard, even though they have a lot of value, or, you know, how do those decisions get made?
It's a great question. Yeah, personally, my standpoint is that the lower Mississippi Valley with all the former bottomland, it was basically would have been America's Amazon. And then you've got the tall grass prairie of the upper Midwest that we basically eradicated. But the good news is those ecosystems are actively being restored by people that care passionately about the future of those systems. And the sky's the limit, I think, in terms of how much we can get done. You talked earlier about, you know, there is a lot of resistance in such high value agricultural areas to changing the land use back to conservation. But you know, if we're expecting folks over in Borneo to not do those palm oil plantations in order to save the orangutans, I think here in the US, we could actually do our part and be restoring our Amazon and the amazing tall grass prairies and everything. So from my standpoint, you know, the most challenging ecosystems are the ones that have been replaced completely by urbanization. And that's not going to be something I can figure out on my own, I think. But ecosystems where it's, you know, the plants have been cut down and replaced by crop agriculture, in many cases, I think we can bring those back and do so in a large scale. There's lots and lots of carbon gains that can be made there too, and for biodiversity. So, yeah, good question.
Again, I'm Rob Glicksman from the GW Law faculty, and it's my task to sort of summarize what we've said and thought and learned about over the past day and a half. I can't possibly capture everything that went on in the last day and a half, but if I can just talk about some of the highlights, I think you'll get some sense of the work that we've done over the past 2 days and the work that remains to be done. So the 30 by 30 initiative originated in the US federal government in the former President Biden's executive order 14008, which was called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, which was published the first week that President Biden took office in January 2021. Section 216 of the executive order tasked various government agencies with the goal of conserving 30% of US land and waters by 2030, hence the short reference to the 30 by 30 initiative. The executive order itself did not create detailed directives for achieving that goal, but it initiated processes by federal agencies to create their own strategies for achieving 30 by 30 goals. So at what problem is this initiative directed? Well, Ron has really told us the answer to that. Much of the land in the US has been industrialized, deforested, and overcultivated. And approximately half of US wetlands in the continental 48 states have been destroyed. One of the speakers yesterday referred to this set of conditions as the disappearance of nature. That disappearance poses, as again Ron has told us, threats to biodiversity, which is essential to the functioning of healthy ecosystems that deliver a host of services that are essential to human survival. Well-functioning ecosystems, again, as Ron told us, are also critically important to society's ability to adapt and to mitigate climate change. Fragmentation of landscapes have made effective conservation that much more difficult. In addition, access to natural resources is an environmental justice issue in that communities of color and low-income communities experience and have experienced for quite some time a disproportionately great share of environmental stressors such as industrial development and pollution. In 2020, the Biden administration issued a report called Conserving and Restoring America the Beautiful. It described how the administration intended to pursue its 30 by 30 goals in several ways. And these ways included the following: using existing laws and programs to create more parks, especially in disadvantaged communities, engaging and assisting tribes in building conservation and restoration projects, expanding existing Fish and Wildlife Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration programs that work to conserve fish and wildlife species, increasing access to outdoor recreation, including hunting, fishing, and hiking, promoting voluntary private conservation efforts through incentives and rewards, and creating jobs in restoration through the American Jobs Plan and newly created Civilian Climate Corps. Over the last day and a half, we have heard from a host of legal, scientific, and policy experts on the challenges posed by efforts to achieve 30 by 30 goals, the progress that's been made to date, and some of the strategies for moving forward with actions that overcome the obstacles that are posed to the success of the 30 by 30 initiative. So as I listened to our speakers over the last day and a half, I identified a dozen challenges that have emerged in our conversation. And I'm going to discuss each of those 12 in no particular order of importance. First, one of the challenges is what I call the capacity or resource challenge. The agencies tasked by the executive order are often underfunded. Some agencies, for example, are hobbled by extreme staffing shortages. We heard yesterday that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been unable to staff more than 300 national wildlife refuges, which remain unmanned. Second challenge is what I call the regulatory or management authority challenge. In some instances, there are real questions about whether Congress has given federal agencies the tools that they're going to need to accomplish their 30 by 30 goals. Agency efforts to engage in innovative strategies may, as a result, face judicial opposition. Third challenge, which I think Ron referred to in his talk, is the definitional challenge. It's not always clear what we mean by conservation and what kinds of lands and waters count as sufficiently conserved to contribute to the 30 by 30 goals. So we need some work done to make sure that everybody's clear on what we're aiming for and what counts toward accomplishing that goal. Fourth, I think there's a public relations challenge. Quite obviously, not everybody's going to be on board with efforts to promote 30 by 30 goals. So how can the initiative be explained in ways that generate support from those who may see conservation as antithetical to economic development and opportunity? A fifth challenge, which I'm not sure we discussed much, but that I think was at least averted to, was the property rights challenge. Pre-existing property rights in lands and waters. A couple of examples would be oil and gas leases executed by the federal government on federal lands, private water rights recognized under state law. These pre-existing property rights may create legal obstacles to efforts to conserve the natural resources that surround these subjects of property rights. So what strategies are available for conserving without infringing on those property rights in ways that may indeed even infringe on constitutional protections? A sixth challenge is what we might refer to as the public outreach challenge. It's not easy to engage all affected stakeholders to ensure that the needs of communities are understood by the government policymakers who are trying to promote 30 by 30 and accommodated in ways that are likely to be acceptable and applauded by those communities. We heard that agencies have sponsored many public meetings. One of the speakers yesterday talked about 17 public meetings that the agency had already held on 30 by 30. As well as other efforts to engage and promote public participation. But she said she doubted whether, even despite all those 17 meetings, the agency had heard from all those who are likely to be affected by its 30 by 30 programs. So how do you engage everybody in ways that make sure that you're getting everybody's input that you need to make effective and acceptable decisions. Another challenge is what I'm calling the precedential or predictability challenge. Conservation efforts from here forward need to proceed in an environment of unbelievable uncertainty. Climate change is altering our world in unprecedented ways. Some people have referred to this as a no analog world. We just don't have anything on which to base a prediction about what's coming in the future. So how can we be sure that conservation efforts will play out the way we want them and expect them to do? And this morning we heard the idea that, well, okay, so we protect this area because we think it's essential to preservation of ecological integrity and biodiversity, but climate change may alter the condition of that ecosystem so that it's no longer the ecosystem we need to essentially conserve ecological integrity. That's now moved over here. So how do we design conservation strategies that are able to accommodate those kinds of on-the-ground shifts? The eighth challenge I identified in listening to the speakers is the equity challenge. And somebody put it this way: 30 by 30 needs to marry equity and conservation. How do we achieve our conservation goals while responding to and alleviating historic inequities experienced by disadvantaged communities? Another challenge is what I'm calling the trade-offs challenge. It may not always be possible to accommodate multiple conservation goals at the same time. Different federal agencies, for example, may have different and incompatible conservation strategies. And so may federal and state and tribal policymakers. So how should we prioritize goals? How should we choose among competing goals? How should we create a hierarchy so that there's a conflict, we decide, all right, this entity or this organization's goals need to be promoted before we seek to accomplish other alternative, supplemental, or competing goals. A 10th challenge is what I'd call the inertia challenge. Sometimes, maybe quite often, it's easier to do nothing than it is to embark on ambitious new pathways. So how do we create incentives for policymakers and communities to promote changes, to establish ways of doing things and cultures that may be resistant to change? Changing the status quo in the face of entrenched interests is not easy and sometimes maybe legally difficult to accomplish. Two more. The 11th is what I call the monitoring and enforcement challenge. Conservation plans may look great on paper, but they won't amount to anything if they're not conscientiously implemented. How can we ensure that agencies do the work they promise to do and that affected stakeholders comply with the legal obligations imposed on them by our conservation strategies? There's a recent book that was written by a former Assistant Administrator of EPA's Office of Compliance and Enforcement Insurance, Cynthia Giles, who basically found that despite persistent beliefs of the country, there's massive non-compliance with the environmental laws, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. One of the originators of the strategy that Cynthia pursues in her book is David Hinden, who's sitting here today, and I want to applaud him for the great work he's done on a program that was referred to as Next Generation Compliance. And it was designed in part to address this situation of massive non-compliance that really is not being effectively addressed. And so I think this challenge, the monitoring and enforcement challenge, kind of brings us back full circle to the capacity and resource challenge, because if you don't have resources, it's hard to monitor and it's hard to enforce in response to the information that you're not getting because you can't do the monitoring. And finally, again, we heard about this in Ron's talk as well as throughout the last couple of days. There's the metrics challenge. How can we measure progress toward achieving 30 by 30 goals? It's not always going to be clear whether durable conservation mechanisms have been established. So what do we do about those 12 challenges? And there may be others, or people may have conceived of them in different ways than I did, but those are the ways that I tried to think about encapsulating and organizing in my own mind what I'd heard over the past day and a half. Well, during the last couple of days, some ideas emerged for how to address the challenges I've identified and in fact, what we're already doing to address those challenges. Let me start by talking about actions already being taken or in the process of being pursued. And I'm just going to mention a few. There were literally dozens that were discussed, but I don't have time to mention them all. And my handwriting wasn't fast enough to take notes that captured all of them anyway. And even if it was, I probably couldn't read it. My wife tells me my handwriting is terrible. So what have we done already? Well, incredibly important was the enactment by Congress on a bipartisan basis of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act, which made billions, literally billions of dollars available to federal agencies to promote environmental goals, including 30 by 30 conservation goals. And we heard spokespersons from the federal agency yesterday talking about how critical that infusion of money is going to be in their efforts to pursue 30 by 30 goals. We heard a lot about coordination among different federal agencies, as well as between federal agencies and tribes. And we heard about the efforts that are ongoing and proposed to promote co-management of certain facilities and resources by the federal government and the tribes. One of the national monuments enacted or established by President Obama, the Bears Ear National Monument, was the first example of a national monument being co-managed by the federal government, the Department of Interior, and the tribes that live in the affected area. We heard a lot about the various statutory programs that are available and that are currently being used, maybe not as much as they could be, but are being used to help start down the road of 30 by 30 conservation. So we heard, for example, about the Endangered Species Act, whose program for requiring consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service by agencies whose actions might jeopardize, endanger, or threaten species or pose threats to critical habitat need to occur. So those consultations can provide the agencies with opportunities to promote and carry out what are called reasonable and prudent alternative methods of achieving their actions in ways that don't jeopardize listed species or adversely affect critical habitat. We heard a lot, and I don't know much about this at all, about the ways that the Farm Bill can be used to promote conservation of agricultural lands. The Antiquities Act is the statute pursuant to which presidents have the authority to establish, unilaterally, establish national monuments. And President Biden established a couple just a couple of weeks ago. And so the Antiquities Act is a way to basically set aside areas of federal land owned by the federal government that can be devoted to conservation-oriented uses. National Marine Sanctuaries Act is an area in a statute that can be used to protect coastal resources. All the organic acts for the federal land management agencies. Organic acts are statutes that basically either create or provide definitions of the authority of relevant agencies. Here we're talking about the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Forest Service. And so some of these organic statutes are already being used. So just last week, the Bureau of Land Management issued a proposed regulation that would essentially change its planning process. And one of the announced highlights of the proposal was that the rule would put conservation on an equal footing with the other multiple uses that the BLM is charged with administering, things like timber harvesting and mining and recreation. So conservation is a legitimate goal of BLM management and ought to be just as important as those other more traditionally emphasized uses. One of the things that the BLM planning rule would do would be to create a new conservation leasing program where people could lease lands from the federal government for a period of up to 10 years for the purpose of restoring ecosystem integrity on those lands. So we'd have leasing now, not for the purpose of extracting oil and gas and coal, but for restoring the natural integrity of the affected area. The rule also indicated that the BLM intended to emphasize more than it has to date its authority to create what are called areas of critical environmental concern, which are again kind of cordon off areas in which certain uses are going to be excluded if they're inconsistent with protecting critically important ecological resources. The Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act is another statute that was mentioned as one that perhaps can be used to promote conservation in areas that are heavily fished. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, also mentioned, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Golden Eagle Protection Act. I'll finish this list of federal programs by talking about two that have great promise, but also great risk. So the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970 was the first statute adopted at the beginning of what's become known as the environmental decade of 1970 and 1980. It really kicked off the federal government's enhanced footprint in the area of environmental protection. This is the statute that requires agencies to think about the potential adverse environmental consequences of what they're planning to do and to prepare environmental impact statements if they're proposing to do something that may significantly affect the quality of the human environment. So the statute created an agency called the Council on Environmental Quality, which is charged, among other things, with overseeing implementation of and enforcement of NEPA by other federal agencies. The CEQ has the authority to issue regulations that interpret agency responsibilities under NEPA. And CEQ issued regulations, I think, in 1986 or so, in which it basically laid out a roadmap for agencies to use in complying with NEPA. Those regulations, with one tiny little exception, basically remained in effect until 2020, when the Trump administration completely overhauled the CEQ regulations in ways that, in my view, terribly weaken the statute's potential to basically induce agencies not to push forward with programs and plans that are going to be environmentally destructive, but instead to think about and remedy those actions so that they're environmentally protective rather than environmentally destructive. There's an article I published with my co-author Alex Camacho in the Environmental Law Reporter, which is published by the Environmental Law Institute, Jared's organization, that you may want to look up. We addressed the proposed version of the Trump regs, but we identified a series of problematic aspects of those regulations. So the Biden administration has already revised discrete portions of those regulations, basically restoring the provisions that have been in effect since 1986, requiring, for example, once again, agencies to do assessments of the cumulative impacts of various actions, which the Trump regulations had essentially eliminated. And the Council on Environmental Quality has told us that it's going to engage in a second round of revisions to the Trump regulations, which are going to be more all-encompassing, basically a complete holistic look at the regulations to see what needs to be done to improve them. So I don't know, I don't have inside information, but I expect that proposal to surface in the relatively near future, and we'll see what it has to say. But there's a potential downside, at least from my perspective, and that is that various members of Congress are in the process of proposing legislation that would accomplish what they're called permitting reform. And for some people, this means thinking about ways to make it easier for the federal government to approve the infrastructure that's needed to allow renewable energy that's generated in places that are kind of off the grid to be moved into and connect with the grid. But other members of Congress are using this permitting reform idea to basically use it as a Trojan horse to basically weaken environmental law in a whole variety of ways. In one of the bills, I think it's HR 1, that's currently on the floor of Congress, but basically not basically, would codify the 2020 Trump NEPA regulations, build them into statute instead of simply regulation. I think that would be a terribly, terribly destructive move, but it's on the table. Even if that version of permitting reform is not adopted, I think there's the potential for amendments to NEPA be made that will allow agencies to exclude more and more of their actions from NEPA evaluation, which I think is a dangerous way to go. And then the final federal program I'll talk about is one that's established under the Clean Water Act. I mentioned that about half of the wetlands in the US have been destroyed over the years. The Clean Water Act has a program called the Dredge and Fill Permit Program that basically requires the Army Corps of Engineer with EPA's oversight to approve or disapprove of efforts to dredge or fill wetlands. It's our primary federal statutory wetlands conservation tool. And it's got the potential to do a lot of good work. But there's a case before the Supreme Court right now, called Sackett versus EPA, which basically goes to the question of what's the scope of coverage of the dredge and fill permit program. The program applies to discharges of dredge or fill material into, quote, waters of the United States, unquote. There's been enormous controversy, disputation about what that term means over the past 50 years, but especially in the last 20 years or so. And the court held oral argument. The decision is pending. It could enhance protection or at least preserve protection of wetlands under the dredge and fill permit program, but it could, in other versions of an opinion, significantly cut back on the amount of wetlands and other waters that are protected by the dredge and fill permit program. So those are two things to watch. The fate of NEPA in the context of both the CEQ regs and permitting reform, and the fate of the dredge and fill permit program after the Supreme Court weighs in. Tied into that, the Biden administration recently issued its own set of dredge and fill permit regulations, its own definition of waters of the United States. That regulation has been enjoined in at least one jurisdiction by a federal district court in Texas, which said the regs don't apply, at least for now, in Texas and Idaho. So again, there's great uncertainty there. And then finally, in terms of the ongoing efforts, again, Ron referred to some of these. There are various state programs that are pursuing 30 by 30 conservation goals. In October 2020, California's governor issued an executive order that basically weighed in and committed to 30 by 30. New York passed legislation that was designed to promote 30 by 30 goals last year. It's created something called an open space plan to help accomplish that. So those are things that are already going on. This morning, we had a workshop that sought to generate input on what we might do in addition to these ongoing efforts that would contribute to our likelihood of achieving 30 by 30 goals and beyond. And again, I listened to the various contributions, and I'm sure there are things that flew over my head or under my radar screen. But in my few remaining minutes, what I want to do is to talk about what I found to be 7 categories of actions that we might think about promoting in order to make 30 by 30 a reality. So some of the ideas that I heard this morning were conceptual in nature. One of our contributors talked about building into conservation programs under 30 by 30 and elsewhere, concepts of international that have been really helpful in promoting environmental protection. Things like the concept of additionality, that you're really making an additional contribution, not simply moving pieces around. So it looks like you're saving this piece over there, but you're destroying that piece over there so that you've got a net gain of zero. The idea is, all right, let's make sure that what we're doing is on a net basis, a move in a positive direction. Ecological representation, the idea that you can't just save areas at random and say you're doing a good job. You have to assess which areas are most ecologically critical and focus your conservation efforts on those areas. And Ron talked about connectivity. We want to make sure that we're working to achieve lands that are connected to one another so that if climate change induces changes in wildlife behavior, the affected wildlife has someplace to go instead of basically being run up higher and higher on a mountain until there's no place else to go. Another idea that I thought was conceptual in nature was to tie conservation system boundaries to ecosystem functioning instead of to geographic metrics like GPS coordinates. In other words, create movable protected areas. So that if, as I said before, the area that looks like it's essential for conservation now turns out 15 or 20 years from now not to be so. The example I like to use that's kind of analogous to this is Joshua Tree National Park, which may not have Joshua trees for that much longer because they're not capable of surviving in the climate as it's been altered in the last decades. And so if we're going to create a park to conserve a certain essential ecological resource or function, let's make sure that we can move the boundaries, or at least try to move the boundaries of the protected status so that it lines up with what's happening on the ground. And then someone mentioned the idea of incorporating anti-racist paradigms into conservation program design and implementation to help promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice goals. Second category of suggestions that I heard this morning involve what I might call innovative uses of existing laws, or using portions of existing laws that have been overlooked to date. And so a couple that were mentioned, and one of them was mentioned quite frequently yesterday as well, was use of various provisions of the Endangered Species Act. I talked about the ESA's provisions that are designed to force agencies whose actions might harm listed species to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is our expert federal agency, to find out if there's a problem, and if so, what to do about it. But there's another provision of the statute, Section 7A1, which is called the affirmative conservation duty provision of the statute. And what it basically does is to impose an obligation on all federal agencies to use all of their existing statutory authorities in ways that are capable of conserving threatened and endangered species. Now, you've probably got thousands of judicial opinions on what the consultation provisions of the statute require agencies to do and whether they've been complied with. I could probably count on one hand the number of decisions that address the affirmative conservation duty. It just hasn't been used much. And so that's an untapped resource, is what I heard people talk about in an effort to promote 30 by 30 conservation goals and conserve and protect wildlife. Someone else this morning talked about Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act, which is the provision that seeks to protect endangered threatened species on private lands through the execution of habitat conservation plans that are approved by the Department of the Interior. So that's another potential resource that perhaps hasn't been used as much as it could be. Somebody talked about using the Clean Water Act program for conservation, mitigation, and banking, which is part of the dredge and fill permit program. The idea is, if you are going to engage in activity that destroys wetlands over here, you need to either enhance or build or create offsetting wetlands over there. Now that's the idea was enunciated during the George H.W. Bush administration as no net loss. We'll make sure that that if we're destroying wetlands, we're restoring others to make sure that we're basically on an even keel. Another idea related to a couple of the organic statutes of the federal land management agencies. And so, for example, the Bureau of Land Management, which is in the Department of the Interior, is an agency that conducts its authority under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. It's a so-called multiple use agency in the sense that its mission is to manage federal lands in ways that are consistent with use of those lands for a variety of uses, ranging from mining, timber harvesting, grazing, to preservation, recreation, etc. My idea was that one of the uses that Flint identifies is watershed. Now, maybe you know what a watershed is a geographic concept. It's okay, an area that's drained by or drained into a certain body of water. What does it mean legally? We don't really know because it really hasn't been developed. But watershed, I argued with my colleague Sandy Zellmer in a recent article, really means maintenance of ecological integrity and water flow. Those are concepts that are consistent with 30 by 30 conservation goals. And so it may be that FLTMA, if it's got the desire to do so, can rely more heavily on its authority to manage for watershed use to manage its lands in ways that are more protective than has been the case to date. National Park Service has authority not only to manage the parks themselves, but to control what are called external threats, activities taking place outside the borders of the parks that might create problems within the park. And so the Park Service might be able to exercise that authority to protect against external threats to basically expand the scope of the areas that are protected currently within the parks themselves. A third category of recommendations I heard this morning involved changes to existing law, not just untapped uses of existing law. And I'll just mention a couple that I heard. One suggestion I heard was that we take steps to eliminate the ability of one coastal state to block desired protective actions being taken by a neighboring coastal state under the authority of the Coastal Zone Management Act. The second suggestion was to eliminate restrictions under state law. I think Iowa was used as the example on land acquisitions for conservation purposes. A fourth category of recommendations fall under the heading of adoption of good conservation practices. So a lot was discussed about shifting to a version of agriculture called smart agriculture, which would seek to expand the ability of agricultural lands to serve as carbon sinks, to prevent nutrient loss, and to protect wildlife corridors, as apparently has been done, at least in some instances, in Louisiana under the Farm Bill. A fifth category would be to use money to prompt desired conservation activity. And there are a variety of ways in which this can be done in the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Congress last November. Basically uses the carrot instead of the stick as a way to promote environmental conservation, making grants and loans available to entities that are going to do things that are environmentally desirable. But what was mentioned this morning was perhaps attaching conditions to federal grants that are environmentally protective in the form of things like real covenants, restrictive covenants. A sixth category of suggestion involved the creation of new institutions. So somebody talked about, it was David Hinden, I believe, talked about the creation of an independent monitor to determine whether 30 by 30 goals are being met. And some suggested that that institution be created based upon a model that is reflected in domestic or international standard boards. We also heard about, it may also have been from David, the idea of creating youth conservation programs that I think would be analogous to the Civilian Conservation Corps that was created during the New Deal. The idea would be to highlight for young people in this country the benefits of a healthy outdoor environment so that they are willing to buy in and promote and push for conservation efforts in the near and not so near future. And finally, the seventh area in which I heard recommendations involved trying to generate a culture shift within the United States at large, largely by promoting education about the need for and importance of conservation and about how individuals contribute to conservation efforts. So a few of the ideas that were thrown out included making environmental documentary films more accessible to people who perhaps don't have broadband access or other facilities to allow them to watch those films. Devoting money, federal money to scholarships, fellowships, and internships for people, especially young people, to be educated in and get some experience in conservation activities. And the importance of including people like Ron, a scientist, in these educational efforts so that we have a mix of lawyers, policymakers, journalists, activists, and scientists, all making sure that we're on the same page about what needs to be done and how that best could be accomplished. So I'm sure there was a lot more that I missed over the last day and a half, but those are some of the important takeaways that I heard. And I believe this is the beginning of a conversation. I think the Wildlands Network is certainly going to carry out this work in the future. We at GW are committed to doing so. The Environmental Law Institute is the foremost nonpartisan NGO in this area. And it was our pleasure to partner with both of those groups, as well as with the University of Oregon. And I hope that the partnership will continue in various ways. And one example would be that we're going to sign off here in a second, but anybody who's in the room is free and encouraged to stay around and keep talking about these issues for the next few minutes or so. So thank you very much for attending. Appreciate your interest and your participation.